Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to another fantastic episode of The Spoken Word. I'm Travis, I'm your host, and today we're going to be continuing this little dark rabbit trail that we've been going on in the last couple of episodes. And today we're going to name some names and discuss the enemies of Yahweh. So we have acknowledged through the last couple of episodes that, number one, there are spiritual entities that exist besides Yahweh, and they are conceived of in the Old Testament. They aren't unique to the New Testament. We have also shown that these beings are very much real players in daily life. We looked at a couple of entities that are somehow connected to nations, if you will. So today we're going to drill down a little bit more and see what else the Old Testament and the New Testament a little bit has to say about some of these entities. So the big thing is that in the Old Testament, and I probably sound like a broken record by now, but if we're going to understand the Old Testament and the story that it's trying to tell, we really need to be in the mindset of the authors and of the people of the day. And what I hope to demonstrate here is that the authors of the Old Testament presumed that the rival gods of other nations that they encounter were not mere paper tigers or wishful thinking or just the inventions of some really imaginative priest's brain. So we're going to read some passages here and meet some of these entities and see how the biblical authors think of them. So I'm going to read these passages with some of the Hebrew exposed. I'm going to stick with the word Elohim that we've discussed many, many times for where maybe your Bible says God or goddess, just for clarity, because it's that word that really at its core means spiritual entity. And that's what I want to hit home here. Sometimes that's going to be simplifying the Hebrew a little bit because there may be variants of that word and it may be a different verb tense or something like Elohe or what have you, but they all come from the same root. They're all going to be underneath the same heading in Strong's Concordance. So it's the same word. It's the same idea. Okay. So I'm just going to simplify that with substituting anywhere I see God or goddess with Elohim or expose another Hebrew as needed. Okay. So probably the first time that we really see Yahweh coming into conflict with another explicit spiritual power, apart from, we can talk about the serpent in the Garden of Eden or something, but that's a whole other rabbit trail in my estimation. I think the best place to start is actually in the book of Exodus, and that's during the 10 plagues that we discussed in a few episodes ago. And the important passage is right before the 10th plague, and Yahweh says this. He says, I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, people and animals. I am Yahweh. I will execute judgments against all the Elohim of Egypt. That's coming from Exodus 12:12. So I've made this contention before in other episodes, but if God is really going to judge the Elohim of Egypt, as he's saying he's going to, that presupposes that there are Elohim or spiritual entities of Egypt to judge to begin with, right? It would be like saying, I'm going to go drive the car. Well, that presupposes that you have a car in order to drive, right? This statement would make no sense if these entities did not exist. Okay, so we have these unnamed gods of Egypt. That is one of our first encounters. They aren't given names in the book of Exodus. They aren't given more detail than that. They're just left nameless. The next group of big baddies that we encounter are the gods of Canaan, chiefly Ashtoreth and Baal, but including some others. So I'm just going to read a few passages where these entities are named in a given list, just for compactness sake. And this isn't going to be exhaustive, but this is going to come from Judges 10:6. It says, then the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. They worshipped the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the Elohim of Aram, Sidon, and Moab, and the Elohim of the Ammonites and the Philistines. They abandoned Yahweh and did not worship him. There's a similar list in 1 Kings 11:33. It says, for they have abandoned me. They have bowed down to Ashtoreth, the Elohim of the Sidonians, to Chemosh, the Elohim of Moab, to Milcom or Molech. I'm inserting that. Milcom and Molech are the same thing. The Elohim of the Ammonites. They have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my sight and to carry out my statutes and my judgments as his father David did. So now that we had just seen some of these lists of names, we've seen Baal, we've seen Ashtoreth, some of these other entities. Recall with me that Moses prophesied about Israel in the future, and that's what we're reading about there in Judges and Kings and so forth. Moses prophesied previously in Deuteronomy that Israel is going to be unfaithful and worship these other entities. And here's the passage from Deuteronomy 32:16-18. He says, speaking about a future Israel, he says, they provoked Yahweh's jealousy with different Elohim. They enraged him with detestable practices. They sacrificed to demons, or Sheddim is the Hebrew word there, not God. To Elohim they had not known, new Elohim they had just arrived, which your ancestors did not fear. You ignored the rock who gave you birth. You forgot the Elohim who gave birth to you. The psalmist also agrees with this judgment. And they said, they served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and daughters to demons. So what's interesting here is that you have Moses and the psalmist saying people sacrificed to demons. And we have passages of people doing just that, right? They're worshiping these other Elohim. And they are specific named entities, Ashtoreth, Baal, and so on and so forth, which are themselves noted as being the Elohim of a certain people. So if these named Elohim are real entities, you can work backwards and get that these entities were thought of as antagonistic spiritual beings, or what later translators would call demons. Okay. So how do these Old Testament demons fit in with the categories in the New Testament of beings like angels and the demons that we meet in the New Testament? Well, according to Paul, the great missionary of the first century, there is no difference. There is no new category. There is complete continuity in his mind. In 1 Corinthians 10:20, he is addressing a question of like, well, Paul, our pagan neighbor over here, decided to go to the temple and worship Zeus. And he brought back some of the steak that they sacrificed to Zeus, and it was dedicated to Zeus. And he wants me to come over for the barbecue. Should I eat the meat? So Paul is addressing this question for these young Christians in Corinth. And Paul basically says there's nothing scary about an idol per se. There's nothing scary about the little rock man that your neighbor has in his closet somewhere. But Paul says, no, but I do say that what they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. Notice the wording there. They sacrifice to demons and not to God. That is exactly lifted from Deuteronomy chapter 32. He is quoting Moses in this passage. So when Paul is thinking about what is happening in the first century pagan temples of his day, I'm talking about the Parthenon. I'm talking about the temple to Artemis in Ephesus. I'm talking about these temples that you can go and find pictures of today. When he's thinking about what was going on in there, he directly copy and pasted Moses's claim from Deuteronomy that these acts of worship were not to benevolent entities, they were to demons. So for the great missionary of the first century, the old Canaanite deities and those worshipped in the temples of Athens, of Corinth, of Ephesus, and everywhere else in the world, all of those entities were of the same class. They were demonic. So Paul is not alone in this as a Christian author. There are many early writers in the early church, and in academic circles, they're usually going to be addressed because the church fathers would be the term you would look up to go find out who these guys were. But one of these early Christian writers was named Justin, and he is called Justin Martyr because, well, they didn't really have surnames at the time. So his name was Justin, and he happened to get martyred. So he's called Justin the Martyr or Justin Martyr. And he lived in AD 100 to 165. So just a little bit after the time of when the book of Revelation, that very last book in the Christian Bible, it was written somewhere in the neighborhood of AD 95-ish. And Justin is going to be writing in the 140s or 150s. So very contemporary with the apostles of Jesus themselves, and certainly very near the birth of the Christian faith. This guy writes a series of apologies, which doesn't mean I'm saying I'm sorry. It's the same root word for apologetics. It means giving a defense of a certain ideology or what have you. So he writes these apologies to the Roman emperor of the day, and the Roman emperor was Antonius Pius, for those keeping score. And he makes a couple of interesting notes in several of his chapters. So I'm just going to quote mine from a few of these. And this is from the 5th chapter of Justin's Apology. He says, "For the truth shall be spoken. Since of old these evil demons, affecting apparitions of themselves, both defiled women and corrupted boys, and showed such fearful sights to men, that those who did not use their reason in judging of the actions that were done were struck with terror, and they, being carried away by fear and not knowing that these were demons, they called them gods, and gave to each the name which each of the demons chose for himself." So when Justin is talking to the emperor about all the gods that the Romans are worshiping, he's like, hey, those are demons. And they're real. They appeared to our ancestors, and our ancestors are so afraid, and they didn't know that they were demons, and they just called them gods. But Justin is making the argument, those are not gods. Those are demons. Those are antagonistic. In the 9th chapter, he again makes this connection, and he says, "And neither do we honor with many sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities as men have formed and set in shrines and called gods, since we see that these are soulless and dead and have not the form of God. For we do not consider that God has such a form as some say that they imitate in its honor. They have the names and forms of those wicked demons which have appeared." Justin is making the argument that we don't make little idols and shrines and stuff to God because we don't think that God has some kind of concrete form that you can make into a little statue. And he says, besides that, these little statues that you all are honoring, they have the names and forms of the real demons that appeared. So in his mind, if you go into the temple of, I don't know, Athena, Artemis, something like that, and you're looking at this statue, in his brain, he would be thinking, well, there was a demonic entity that at some point in the past appeared like this, and that is why people have chosen to have this certain form for this god or what have you. Okay, so, but the point is, in Justin's brain, there's this demonic connection. One last time in chapter 14, he says, "For we forewarn you to be on your guard, lest those demons whom we have been accusing should deceive you and quite divert you from reading and understanding what we say, we Christians. For they," these demonic entities, "they strive to hold you their slaves and servants, and sometimes by appearances and dreams, and sometimes by magical impositions, they subdue all who make no strong opposing effort for their own salvation." So Justin, this guy who is a very early Christian thinker, has somehow come to believe that the gods that the Romans worshipped were very real entities, number one, and number two, that they were demonic. With all of the prep work we've done up to this point, we know that Justin is not pulling this out of the ether somewhere. This is a biblical idea. He is pulling directly from the words of Moses, and he is pulling directly from the words of Paul. So this kind of idea is not an invention that is unique to the early Christian church. So all that being said, there is a continuity of these gods of the Old Testament that we meet, Baal, Ashtoreth, all that kind of stuff. There's continuity into the gods of the pagan world that are encountered in the New Testament, and the entire Bible agrees as well as early Christian authors, all of them agree that these entities have some kind of a demonic connection to them. Now, that does not mean, just for the sake of argument, that does not mean that if you go and make a statue in your backyard, that all of a sudden you have made some kind of new god or something. If you went and made a statue in your backyard and you called him Bob, that does not mean that there is now a spiritual entity out there called Bob. Okay. It's that, and I think that this is probably why the Bible kind of blurs the lines between what is an idol and what is an Elohim, and even why the Hebrew uses the word for all the above. That there are very real entities that are evil. And these very real entities have apparently, according to Justin, have appeared to people and they took on some kind of form, and people made statues that matched that form. Again, this is according to Justin. So that would lead me to say that at a minimum, some, not necessarily all, but some of the gods that we have read about in mythology or textbooks or whatever, these names that have lived on through history, these were apparently at some point, these were connected with a true demonic entity. And that is so far against the grain of what you and I grow up thinking, how our culture treats the paganism of the ancient world. We look at the Greeks and we think about philosophy and just the stories that they told, and we don't really think there's any kind of truth to their mythology or what have you. And I'm not saying that any of this of their mythology is true, but I'm saying that the characters that they speak of, these gods that they worship, those, and certainly in the mind of Paul and in the mind of Justin, those entities are real. Is there some kind of being out there named Zeus? I don't know, but it's possible, I think, according to this line of thinking. So that's a lot to sit on. And I think that it's a very extreme sounding claim, but I think that this is where the Bible would have us understand that there is no such thing as a neutral pagan god. These things are not good. They never have been good. And even if we want to try and take the ancient world and strip it of its religion, that's a very modern idea. They certainly didn't see it that way. They saw that there was something real behind this worship. And that is why the New Testament, especially, and the Old Testament as well, are so bent out of shape about pushing people away from the darkness that happened inside those temples. So that's all for today. Bottom line, demons are real. They were named. Some are worshipped in Canaan, some are worshipped in Corinth, and throughout the rest of the world. So next time, we're going to take one more step into the dark rabbit trail here and discuss that according to the Old Testament, and certainly conceived of in the New Testament as well, these beings are connected to the development of occult practices, and that they are the source of its very real and very dark power. But that's all for me for today. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate every single one of you. I will see you in the next episode. But until then, may God bless you and keep you.